Although the idea of a symbiosis between madness and creativity has been mused upon for ages, this notion, which remains a popular trope, started to gain particular currency in Western culture in the early 19th century. Rejecting the rationalism and the cultural restraints of the Age of Reason, artists in the Romantic era sought truth in sources that weren't compromised by intellectual filters or behavioral norms, believing that the most compelling art arises when the imagination is unbound. In many respects, Robert Schumann fits the role of the mad romantic artist. His struggles with severe mental illness are recorded in a personal diary that's replete with descriptions of the wild mood swings and hallucinations that ultimately culminated in his institutionalization during the final 2 years of his life. While a definitive diagnosis has been difficult to make retrospectively, a scholarly consensus has emerged around two possibilities. The first is a diagnosis of manic depressive illness, which is sustained by ample documentation of Schumann's enormous bursts of creativity and following periods of deep depression. The other is neurosyphilis, complicated by the effects of mercury poisoning. The composer contracted the disease in 1831, when he was 21 years old. The conventional mercury treatments of the day cured his primary symptoms, but Schumann lived with the disease in its secondary stage for most of his adult life, and the horrific psychiatric and physical symptoms that accompany the infection's third and final stage appear repeatedly in the documentary evidence of Schumann's final descent into madness. In light of this history, it's apt to examine the extent to which Schumann's mental disturbances inform his music, and in this regard, the circumstances surrounding the composition of his Second Symphony, as well as the work's content, are instructive. In August of 1844, the composer had a complete breakdown, which manifested itself in trembling, sleeplessness, strange fears of sharp objects, and constant ringing in his ears. He wrote no music for the better part of a year. As his symptoms began to ease in the spring of 1845, he began to work again, expanding a fantasy for piano and orchestra he'd written 4 years earlier into his beloved piano concerto in A minor. He also immersed himself in the music of Bach, and in December, he began work on his Second Symphony, completing a piano version of the entire piece in just 3 weeks. His still fragile psychological state made the process of orchestrating the piece more challenging, and he only completed it 3 weeks before its November 5th premiere in Leipzig, conducted by Mendelssohn. Although Schumann once said he was afraid that the shadow of his emotional struggles hovered over this symphony, it's hard to imagine that a listener who hadn't been told who wrote this music would conclude that it's particularly melancholy, much less the product of a diseased brain. Right from the work's hymn-like opening, the music projects an air of expressive assurance, and the allegro that flows out of this introduction is filled with energy and optimism. The following scherzo is a sensational tour de force for the first violins, and while the exquisite slow movement inhabits an atmosphere of profound sorrow, its tone provides a type of expressive contrast that is structurally conventional in a symphony. And the return to the first movement's ebullience in the finale, which features exultant Bachian counterpoint as well as the transformation of the slow movement's theme into one of ardent joy, is also a standard symphonic device. And so, what are we to make of the fact that an artist besieged with fits of debilitating mental illness could, and would, compose a large-scale work that betrays little, if any, trace of his condition? And what does this imply about the popular meme of madness being a source of creativity? It would certainly be misguided to think that every work of art created by a turbulent soul is a sort of memoir. And the history of art is rife with examples of creativity and the all-encompassing focus the creative process can evoke, providing artists with a means of temporarily escaping their woes. Perhaps this simply reflects the essential difference between art and nature, which is one of human intention, prompted by the impulse to create an idealized order out of apparent randomness. In this respect, the inspiration Schumann found in the music of that ultimate sonic artificer, Bach, is revealing, and he was far from alone among musicians in his veneration of the Baroque master's ability to create stunningly profound musical structures. Like every great artist, Schumann understood that if the primitive sources of artistic inspiration are to be effectively expressed, a high degree of control is essential. When the music of his final years founders, it's not because of an excess of wild, naturalistic, quasi-diabolical expression, but rather because its lack of focus and organization creates a blunted, washed-out effect. Thus, Schumann's Second Symphony is a representation of his heroic, ongoing personal struggle to achieve lucidity through artistic work. He created this masterpiece, one of many, not because of his illness, but in spite of it.